and today I will be reading from August Folly by Angela THIRKELL, not Angela Merkel. At the moment when our story opens, on a warm June morning last summer, Mrs. Tebben was in her drawing room reviewing a book on economics. Happening to raise her eyes to the window, she saw Mrs. Palmer opening the garden gate, so she went to warn her husband. Mr. Tebben was a civil servant during the week from 10 or 11 to 6, or such later hours as his country might require, and carried an umbrella, wet or fine. But in the evenings and from Saturday to Monday, he gave himself entirely to the past, taking for his province the heroic age of Norway and Iceland, with excursions into the English epic. During the war, his knowledge of the Scandinavian tongues had been of great use to the censors department, from which he had emerged scatheless owing to his great presence of mind in deliberately forgetting to acknowledge the official communication offering him an inferior order of the empire he had served. He was at this moment sitting in his very small, uncomfortable study, drafting a letter to a learned society of which he was president, and he did not wish to be disturbed. "Warning, Gilbert, warning!" cried Mrs. Tebben, putting her head in at the study door. "Louise Palmer!" As her husband only stared at her with the expression of a mad and rather obstinate bull startled from its dreams, she began to insert herself into the room. To open the door wider was impossible because of the furniture. "Louise!" cried Mrs. Tebben again, getting herself through the door and shutting it behind her. "Her van will be upon us before the bridge goes down." "Her van?" asked Mr. Tebben, justifiably puzzled. "Oh, I thought you meant she was bringing the milk lorry down the garden. Well, I can't see her. I'm busy. I'm writing to Fanshawe. The letter ought to have been sent a week ago. Can't you stop her?" "You'll have to see her sooner or later," said his wife. "It's about her Greek play. You know she wants you to do Theseus, and she said she would take no denial." "I certainly won't be Theseus," said Mr. Tebben. "I won't wear sandals and catch cold and wash my feet in that leaky basin of Margaret's. I've never acted in one of her plays yet, and I never will. Besides, what does that woman know about Greek plays? Let Richard do Theseus when he comes down, or Margaret, or Mrs. Palmer's nephew that she's always talking about. I will not make a fool of myself. You really must tell her I'm busy, Winifred." "So be it," said Mrs. Tebben. But it was not, for Mrs. Palmer, who had annoyingly come round by the garden, in at the drawing room window, and so through the hall, now intruded herself. Those who did not admire Mrs. Palmer both disliked and feared her hectoring methods, but she was entirely indifferent to moral temperatures. Her husband avoided her activities as much as possible, and was very fond of her, having that affectionate reverence for his wife, which is one of the advantages, from the female point of view, of the childless marriage. It is so much more difficult for a husband to cherish and revere the mother of several healthy children who take possession of her time and devotion. Mr. Palmer's only and much younger sister, Rachel, had married Frank Dean, the head of a large engineering firm. The Deans had lived abroad a good deal on account of Mr. Dean's work, and their large family had made the manor house a kind of headquarters. Of late, they had not been down so often and were not well known to the Tebbens. The nephew that, according to Mr. Tebben, Mrs. Palmer was always talking about was Lawrence Dean, her eldest son. He had been for some years in his father's firm and was eventually to inherit most of Mr. Palmer's property. His aunt Louise was devoted in her high-handed way to him and his brothers and sisters, and made as much fuss over them as if she were the hen that had hatched someone else's eggs. "News, news," cried Mrs. Palmer, waving a letter at the Tebbins. "I had to come round and tell you, Winifred, and as I met your Mrs. Phipps at the store, I knew there would be no one here to answer the bell, so I came creeping round by the drawing room. I shall just tell you about it and run away, for the great man must not be disturbed." Mr. Tebbin, who detested being called a great man, got up, but was unable to offer his caller a seat as he had the only chair in the little room, and Mrs. Palmer could not have squeezed her stout, imposing person behind the table. Luckily, Mrs. Tebbin, who in some ways had never developed spiritually since the days of cocoa parties in a bed-sitting room at college, remembered refreshments and said to Mrs. Palmer, "Oh, you must have a cup of tea. Mrs. Phipps will be back in a moment and the kettle is just on the boil. We always have tea in the morning. Come into the drawing room and Gilbert will join us." Rather suspiciously, Mrs. Palmer allowed herself to be led into the drawing room, where sofas and chairs heaped with papers showed that Mrs. Tebbin had been working. It was a pleasant side of Mrs. Tebbin's character that although her own books were described, by those who read them, as important, she was entirely modest about what she had done and never dreamt of demanding elbow room or solitude for herself, although she accepted their necessity for her husband. There were more bookcases, photographs of places in Norway and Iceland that they had visited before children put such an expense out of the question, and in a corner a small upright piano, celebrated for having belonged to Mr. Tebbin's mother, but possessing no other merit. Mrs. Tebbin, clearing an armful of papers and a huge tabby cat off the sofa, invited her visitor to sit down. "It's about the Deans," said Mrs. Palmer. "I have had a letter from Rachel. She and Frank and 5, or is it 6, of their children are coming to the Dower House for the summer." "Mr. Palmer's sister and her husband," cried Mrs. Tebbin. "Gunner, put your claws in." "Yes, Fred is so delighted, and so am I, because they will be able to help with my play. You know we are doing Hippolytus this summer, and that is partly what I came to see you about." "I must see about the tea," said Mrs. Tebbin, getting up. "I'll send Gilbert to you if you'll excuse me for a moment." "Gilbert! Gilbert!" she shouted as she passed the study door. "Mrs. Palmer is alone in the dressing room. Entertain her. I must see about some tea," and so disappeared into the kitchen. Mr. Tebbin unwillingly rose, went into the drawing room, saved Mrs. Palmer from Gunner, who was preparing to sharpen his claws on her skirt, sat down beside her and said nothing. "We are doing Hippolytus this summer, you know," Mrs. Palmer said for the second time. "We know that you are only free at weekends, but we are very anxious to get you. Theseus cries out for you in the part." "Oh, Greek isn't my subject," said Mr. Tebbin. "The Scandinavian languages are more in my line. Now, if you were doing something in the nature of a saga, but no, it wouldn't do. No, I positively couldn't act, even in a saga. Besides, I don't think the village would understand Norse." "But we aren't acting sagas," said Mrs. Palmer. "It's Euripides." "Oh, Greek is much the same," said Mr. Tebbin. "They wouldn't understand Greek. I really don't think they would." "It isn't Greek, it's English, a translation." "Well, I don't think they'd understand a translation either," said Mr. Tebbin determinedly. "My nephew Lawrence Dean, that you have so often heard me talk about," said Mrs. Palmer, trying a fresh point of attack, "will be here for the summer. His parents, my sister-in-law and her husband, will be at the Dower House with some of their children. I mean Lawrence to do Hippolytus. Now, if you did Theseus, we should at least feel that we had a nucleus." Mrs. Tebbin now came in with a 3-legged cake stand, followed by Mrs. Phipps carrying a wavering brass tray of tea things. When the tray had been balanced on an 8-legged folded stand, Mr. Tebbin got up. "2 legs sits on 3 legs, milking 4 legs, he said meditatively. "Dear Mother Goose. Well, I must get back to work. That letter to Fanshawe should have been written a week ago. Goodbye, Mrs. Palmer. Villagers understand nothing, so it really will not matter what you do." with which helpful remark he picked up the tabby cat and, going quickly back to his study, resumed his letter to Mr. Fanshawe, whose society held outrageous views about the elder Edda. "What a splendid Theseus he would make," said Mrs. Palmer as her host went out. "Milk?" said Mrs. Tebben. "I'm afraid he'll never get Gilbert to do Theseus. In fact, I know he won't. Gunner! Gunner! Do you want some milk? Oh, Gilbert must have taken Gunner into the study. You know, he doesn't like the Greeks. Gilbert, I mean. He says they were uncomfortable." "Well, it can't be helped," said Mrs. Palmer, taking a notebook out of her bag and crossing out an entry. "We shall have to find someone else. It isn't a big cast. Theseus, Hippolytus, a huntsman and a henchman are all the men. Margaret will be the huntsman, and Patton, my second gardener, the henchman. I dare say Pollitt at the shop will do Theseus if Mr. Tebben really can't be persuaded. And then about Hippolytus. Oh, our son Richard comes down today and might be able to help. He will be here all the summer, I hope. He has been doing grades, so he would know the play. Not in English, of course, but then he knows the original and could get the spirit," said Mrs. Tebben, going into the trance of adoration which any thought of Richard always induced. "Perhaps he would train the chorus for me," said Mrs. Palmer with great presence of mind. "That is where real skill is required. I had thought of Lawrence for Hippolytus. He has had a good deal of experience. He is in his father's engineering firm, and they have an excellent amateur dramatic society." She did not add that, in her opinion, anyone whose ears stuck out as much as Richard's was naturally disqualified for a part which did not demand a wig. Mother and aunt by marriage, each eager in the defence of her absent young, were silent for a moment, massing their forces for the next move. Mrs. Palmer, who had quicker wits than her friend, got in first. "I wish there were a part for you, Winifred," she said regretfully. "Your Lady Montague was such a success the year we did Romeo and Juliet. I could hardly ask you to do the nurse in Hippolytus." There was no inflection of interrogation in her voice, but Mrs. Tebben chose to take it that there was. "Of course I'll do the nurse," she said obligingly. "It's a longer part than Lady Montague, but I learnt those 2 lines very easily, and it will simply be a question of application. I shall give myself regular hours for study, as I used to do in the old days. And what about you?" Mrs. Palmer had been thinking very quickly. "I shall lead the chorus," she said, feeling that by so doing she could foil any attempt on Richard's part to train the villagers in his own way. "And my niece Helen, Lawrence's sister, will do Artemis. She drives a racing car. That fat daughter of Mrs. Phipps, Doris I mean, will have to do Aphrodite because Mrs. Phipps is helping with the dresses, and that only leaves Phaedra. Neither of Dr. Thomas's girls from the rectory can act without giggling, and I don't want to ask Lady Bond because we are at war about a fence. My sister-in-law, Lawrence's mother, would take the part, I'm sure, and she looks wonderfully young for 48, but she cannot ever remember her words. What shall we do?" "Margaret will be coming home next week," says Mrs. Tebben, suddenly remembering the daughter whom, in her worship for Richard her son, she often forgot. "She has been at Grenoble with a family, not Greeks, but highly cultured people, and I think she said something about having met Lawrence there in one of her letters." Because her mother could only think of Richard, Margaret, who was 2 years younger, was often forgotten like that. Her father also let her existence slip from his mind at times, not because he adored Richard, whom indeed he vaguely found rather trying, but because his mind was usually on letters to Fanshawe and similar subjects. So she had been sent to Germany and then to France when she left school, and there might have remained forever if her father, suddenly remembering her existence, had not demanded her return. Mrs. Tebben, arguing that as her husband was paying for the child's education, he had a perfect right to see her, had agreed. And now came her reward, for Margaret would be a useful pawn to play against Mrs. Palmer. As that lady had no alternative left, she was obliged to accept enthusiastically, only wishing that Margaret were rather more hideous than she remembered her, as so very pretty a person might attract Lawrence, her son, whom she destined for a good marriage. "And then that's all settled," said Mrs. Palmer. "Tell Richard to come over and see me as soon as he gets back. He might dine with us tonight after the choral. And tell Margaret too, of course, as soon as she comes home. We can't begin rehearsing too soon. And do you mind if I have Mrs. Phipps on Wednesday afternoon? She can do a lot of machining for me, and I know you're nearly always in town in the middle of the week. Say goodbye to the great man for me. I shall just slip out again as I came in." Mrs. Tebben watched her visitor go with mixed feelings. To have Richard refused for Hippolytus and Mrs. Phipps commandeered for Wednesdays was intolerable. On the other hand, she as nurse and Richard as chorus master would have the play a good deal in their own hands, and certainly Richard would not have wanted to play Hippolytus to his sister, of whom he thought as poorly as he did of his parents. If Mrs. Palmer thought she could manage the chorus against Richard's wishes, let her try. And Gilbert was safely out of it, which reminded her that he had not had any tea, so she poured out a cup and took it into the study. "I'm afraid it's rather cold and stewed," she said, putting it down on the table.